A warm welcome to Pitbulls of the Lord Spiritual Warfare channel. My name is Ira, and I'm going to begin with the Lord's Prayer in Latin. In nomine Patri, Filii, Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum. Adveniat regnum tuum. Fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum de nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debite nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris. Et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. In nomine Patri, et Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So, as murder and cannibalism, human trafficking, warfare, and all the insanity and heinous things that are happening in the world today are playing out in this world, I want to share a story with you about how God is still at work in the world. And even with the worst of us in the worst of times, He's still working. And this is my story. It's also a mother's story. It is a strange and beautiful story set in a dark and Luciferian world. My former world. To me, this story is evidence that God exists, but it's only a story to you. So I ask you to discern for yourselves. The story begins with, I was not born Christian. No one in my family for generations was Christian. There were no sacramentals, no crucifixes. No one spoke of God in my childhood home. And of course, I would follow in my family's footsteps. I became an occultist with all its many faces and forms. I said this was a mother's story, and it is. So I start with my blood mother, who was a demoniac. She was possessed by a powerful generational spirit. Whether she chose to allow this willfully or not, she was a victim of evil. Generational spirits are passed down to us through ancient covenants amongst our ancestors. And these covenants are done for power and control. Future generations, as many as 7 future generations, are sacrificed, so to speak, to the god or goddess, the fallen angel, the generational spirit of that family line. So no matter what or who you are still a child of God. And I try to remember at my mother's birth, she was a child of God, a pure child of God. And I love her. I love her still. She's passed on. But I do not love the fallen angel and demons that possessed her. And I certainly don't endorse what these beings influenced her to do. In the last 3 years of my mother's life, she lived with me. And the entity often manifested with a vengeance in her later years. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about her behavior, I'm talking about supernatural things occurring in the home. For example, voices were heard, electrical appliances would blow up, water would come leaking through the ceiling and the walls in a very well-kept brand new house. Things would blow up, animals would get sick. Things manifested and demanifested without explanation. They would bleed in and out of reality, much like your car keys are on the table and then right before your eyes, they simply disappear. Of course, there is a lot of theatrics going on with lights going on and off, etc. At night, I would be assaulted by horrific visions, and that was not normal for me. My bedroom was on the first floor, just below her bedroom. And so I was actually sleeping right below her. I think it was very easy for the demons, the fallen angel, to just drop right down into my sphere. And I would visualize horrific visions coming at me fast and furiously. And this was the same as in my childhood, very similar. Once I left home as an adult, none of these things happened to me. And as I often describe the paranormal, these things don't happen to me in the grocery store. They don't happen to me in the bathroom of someone else's house. And whenever I would ask her, what is going on? We're not supposed to engage with the fallen angel, but it was my mother possessed by one. I would ask, what is going on? And her answer was always very cryptic. It would be something like, oh, don't worry, it'll go away. As if she's acknowledging she knows that I know that she knows. Or she would respond with, if I will something, it happens. And that's Aleister Crowley. This generation was confirmed many times to me. And there's a lot more to it, involving my sister, who is the firstborn. But these things usually pass down in the maternal line from mother to firstborn daughter. As you know, the goddess aspect is very much a part of the occult. When my mother was manifesting diabolically, her voice would change into a deep, dark, masculine voice. And her eyes would darken, literally, physically darken. When this would happen, her face would even morph and become more masculine. And sometimes it would bring up a topic that was very painful to me. It would speak of helping my father along at the moment of his death. So it always knew which buttons to push with me. When I would inquire what had happened at Bohemian Grove, I was asking it, not her. It would simply answer with, in that deep masculine voice, you know what happened. So one day, my mother was manifesting, and I simply walked away from it because as an ex-occultist, I knew what it was. I thought I knew how to deal with it. And I walked away. And my phone rang. And the voice on the other end of the phone was the dark, gravelly, masculine, horrific, whispery voice. And it was saying something, but it was saying something in a language I didn't understand. And I had fluently spoken French in my life, fluently spoken Castellano, Spanish, and English. It's very obvious if someone's speaking an Asian language such as Chinese or Japanese. This was none of those things. It was repeating the message. It was trying to tell me something or spell me. I'm not sure which. But I ran back into my mother's room to see if it was her. And she was staring straight ahead, still locked in that manifestation state. But she was not on her phone. And when I checked the caller ID, it simply read, unknown. Now, many exorcists have received text from the fallen angelic or the demons. And the way they know this is because those texts and phone calls are either in a forgotten or dead language, or they know something about the priest or the victim soul that's being exorcised in a way that no one else could have known. So, as we know in the paranormal community or the supernatural realm, electronics are easily influenced. Yeah, people get text texted from a demon. And that night I also had tremendous visions, as I recall. When I look into my mother's eyes when she was manifesting, if you've ever looked into a possessed person's eyes, it is the deepest, darkest abyss of hatred. In fact, you've never seen it unless you've actually looked into the eyes of a possessed person. This anger is supernatural. It doesn't even exist within the human scale of degrees of emotions. No human can make you feel this amount of hatred. It is so profound that it almost feels like it's wounding you, but it's not wounding you, it's scarring you. As we know, a wound will heal, but a scar doesn't heal. And that scarring is a marking. If you are living with someone like that close to you, make sure that you get yourself to a priest, a Catholic priest, or you get the person to a Catholic priest, if you can. As an ex-occultist, at the time I was a practicing occultist, that was the last thing I was going to do. I wish I knew then what I knew now. So I also want to remind you that I was born on an occult feast day, the same day that Bohemian Grove was dedicated. And I was born to a woman possessed. My astrological chart, my birth chart, is the strangest thing anyone has ever seen. So growing up the way I did somehow is, I don't want to say important, but something to be noted. Why was I born into the family I was born into? Why was I taken to Bohemian Grove? Why was I born on the day it was dedicated to Diana? Why do I have such a strange birth chart? Now, an occultist would say that means something. It doesn't matter if you believe it, they believe it. So, lastly, at my mother's death, I witnessed something so terrible I can't even speak about it. And it spoke to the transgender nature. It spoke to the transgender nature of the fallen angels or the gods, such as Baphomet. All these things signal something. I had been groomed, and beginning in my early 20s, I had been educated within the occult circles. For me, my education and occult foundation was necessary for some reason. God allowed it. And you'll come to understand that as I began to tell my story in earnest. God had other plans for me. And when God made his move, Lucifer never saw it coming. God flipped me like a switch the moment I was to be in service to him. He took me from occultist to Christian literally overnight. Literally in the blink of an eye. In the blink of an eye, I became, in my heart, Roman Catholic. It was put onto my heart that I would become Roman Catholic, and that I also must pray in Latin and get to an old rite Latin Mass. I didn't know what these things were, but it was put into me, here and here. I had to do these things, and it wasn't even a choice per se. I was driven to it. Now, all this was happening when you couldn't even get into a church. Nobody's church was open. I wasn't Catholic. I couldn't get confirmed or go to catechism. Nothing. But God was at work. and God had a plan. And you could say, after all of that, I was the devil's mistake. He had invested into me my entire life. And very late in my life, God simply flipped a switch and said, no, you're on my team. And you'll notice that sometimes when God can't get our attention, he sends his mother. In my lifetime, he has sent his mother 3 times. Once, twice, thrice. Though I was far from Christian. And at the end of this story, you'll know why. So the story begins walking into a little house located on our family estate behind tall iron gates. And it was a little house that was run down and overgrown with brambles and foliage and blackberries, and you could barely see the roof. It was as if the earth was trying to take it back and reclaim it. And my mother, I followed my mother in. My mother had her measuring stick and her paint swatches. She unlocked the door, and when we walked through it, I almost went to my knees. The walls from floor to ceiling were spattered in red blood. I was only a child, perhaps 8, 10. All the walls in the house were splattered with blood from floor to ceiling. My mother never once looked back at me. She began measuring for curtains and checking paint swatches against the wall. What was going to happen in the future of this house was my sister was returning from a finishing school in Switzerland, and she was pregnant. And my mother was going to refurbish this house, splattered in blood from floor to ceiling, and my sister was going to live there. A month later, my sister was going to babysit me. And I was brought down to the house, and that night I was put on the couch with a blanket, and the lights were turned out, and my sister went to bed. And just a child, I could feel the walls, those blood-spattered walls. I still could see them very clearly, even though the walls were now covered over in a cheerful yellow paint. They were closing in on me, and I could feel the evil presence, and I couldn't understand how my sister didn't feel it or how she would even want to be there. It was so powerful and so visceral. And I began to cry, and it was very, very dark. And then slowly, a beautiful, soft glow began to blossom next to me, standing over me. She was female. She smelled of flowers. And she was wearing a beautiful white dress and veil, and all of her was entirely made of light. The lace of her dress, I could see each thread very precisely glowing with white light. I could see the pattern of her veil glowing with white light. She was very demure. Her face was behind the veil. She was maybe 4.5 feet tall. Very soft, very beautiful, and she exhumed the love of a mother. And it was almost as if instantly whatever evil was in that house was simply displaced and sent out. And I was able to gently, very quickly fall asleep. Time went by, and that memory of the little house spattered in blood faded. I was now 25 years old. I had had a dark and painful life growing up. Even at a young age, I had seen much evil. The world had done its worst with me. I had been raped, used, and abused. By 20 years old, I had had 5 abortions, beginning again at 14. Each time my mother had commissioned the procedure, but now I was an adult and on my own and pregnant with a child that I would have died for. I wanted that child. I would have done anything to save that child's life within me. But I began to bleed. And so I rushed to the doctor and an ultrasound was performed. There was no heartbeat. I was told the child within me was no longer living. And I was told I would schedule the surgery and I was to go home and come back and have the procedure. That night when I went home, I had a dream. A beautiful woman appeared standing on a rock in the middle of a desert, and she had long flowing robes of blue and white. Her veil was taken away by the wind, and she had beautiful hair blowing in the wind. She was very demure, maybe 4.5 feet tall. And she said to me, "You're going to have a boy child." Very specific. The dream was so visceral and so real that the next morning I called the doctor and I canceled my surgery. Each week or every few days, the doctor's office would call me and try to frighten me to come in and have that surgery. They would say, "You could bleed to death. You could die. You're going to have a lot of pain." But I kept thinking of the lady, the beautiful lady in my dream, and I refused. A month and a half or 2 later, I decided, after all the phone calls, to return for another ultrasound. I had to know as well. And I will never forget the look on that doctor's face when the ultrasound began to show a heartbeat beating, and I could hear it. My son was alive within me, and his heart was beating. And had it not been for the lady in my dream, I would have never had him, and he would not be living today. So again, a mother's story. But I was still not thinking of God or recognizing this beautiful lady's true identity. I was still doing what good occultists do, being my own God and living my own life without God. Even though, just because I didn't know God was there or I wasn't caring God was there with me. So that was once, and that was twice the woman appeared. The 3rd time she appeared to me is the most epic part of my story. 23 years ago, I was given a rosary by a beloved childhood friend's mother, who was Irish Catholic, and it remained in the bottom of my jewelry box for all of those 23 years. Then the woman who had given it to me died, and I went and took it out. It was broken. I put it back together, and I thought of her. And then I Googled how to pray the rosary for dummies. I prayed the rosary for her. And she had said to me that this rosary was special, that it was exorcised and blessed, and that it came from Lourdes, and that in the heart of it, it had holy water from Lourdes in it. But when she gave it to me, this woman was staggeringly drunk. I don't even know if she would have remembered giving it to me, but she staggered down the hallway in a Hawaiian sarong and Hawaiian lace around her neck, and she shoved it into my hands and she said, "Here, you need this." God bless you, Barbara, for your drunken kindness. She had battled those demons her entire life, but God works in very strange and mysterious ways. when I had Googled how to pray the Rosary for Dummies, and I prayed it one time, the next day I had to pray it again. The next day I had to pray it again. Now you have to remember, every day of my life, I was doing a battery of occult rituals every day, invoking, you know what, this, that, the other thing. But after a time, all I wanted to do was pray that rosary. It just felt so beautiful, so good, that I would tell my friends who were occultists, you have to try this. It's amazing. You have to pray the rosary. And they would look at me like, oh, okay. They thought I was a lunatic. But I prayed that rosary for about 2 months. And one night, I was laying in bed and I started to smell the smell of flowers. Now, a moment before, I had had a conversation with the devil, basically. I had been thinking, I want to become Catholic. I want to get to Holy Communion. I want to give a confession. I want to be a part of the Roman Catholic Church. But I can't even get to church. I can't give a confession. I'm doomed. And the devil would be answering me, the Catholic Church doesn't want anything to do with you. You're an occultist. You're a heretic. They're too busy worrying about a virus and baptizing and marrying people, and they don't want anything to do with you. You have evil tattoos. They're going to know who you are. And I started to cry, and I was smelling those flowers. My dogs were on the end of the bed, and all of a sudden it started, and it hit me like a torrent. It was like a tornado smashed into my consciousness. Every single thing, evil thing, hurtful thing I had ever done in my life started flashing before my eyes. Every awful thing I had ever done. Every pain I had caused another person. And it was rapid fire. It was so fast, I don't know how in the Lord's name I was able to remember it. But it was worse than that, because I was feeling the pain I was causing others. And then I was feeling the pain of the people they went out and hurt. After I had catalyzed pain in their life, they would go out and hurt 2 or 3 other people, and I was feeling their pain. It was like the butterfly effect on steroids. It was horrific. And each moment that passed, I got heavier and heavier and heavier, to the point where I couldn't even lift myself up out of the bed to stop it. It was holding me down. An entire life of filth and pain and horror was holding me down on the bed. I couldn't even lift it. And at this point, I'm crying out, oh my God, I'm a monster. God, forgive me. God, please forgive me. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I'll never get to confession. I'll never get Holy Communion. I'll never be able to get into a church. I'll never become Roman Catholic. And suddenly, as I'm laying there in this deep, heavy filth, another presence enters the room. Only this presence is not feminine, it's masculine. And it is filled with the most peace and love I have ever experienced in my life. I don't even think it exists on planet Earth. This feeling was so profound. It cleansed everything off of me. It took all of the filth and guilt and sin and pain. It lifted it off of me as if it were feathers. And as this male presence began to pull away out of the room, this stern, loving, strong presence, I felt all of my sin, all of my filth go with it. But also the most painful part of this whole experience was the peace and love as it left. I wanted to go with it. I wanted so much to go with it that I will spend the rest of my life trying to connect to that level of peace and love that I felt in what I believe was Jesus Christ. I mean, who am I? Nobody. But I think that when we can't get to God, even though we want to, God does come to us. And in the end, remember the beginning of this story, that I was born on the Feast of Numeralia, the day Bohemian Grove was dedicated. What I didn't know was I am also born on the Feast of the Assumption of Mary, the day the Mother of God was assumed into heaven. Mary is my patron saint, and even though I was far from Christian, she came to me 3 times. She protected me 3 times. She changed my life 3 times in the most monumental of ways. And because I wasn't paying attention, and God couldn't get my attention, it came to a point, even though He had protected me, I had been born to a woman possessed, I had lived an occult life, but He protected me the whole time. And I think my life was necessary. It was my formation, because God had another plan for me. Here I am, speaking about God to all of you. And as Thomas Aquinas once said, I have been all things unholy. If God can work through me, He can work through anyone. Saint Thomas Aquinas, theologian, philosopher, an occasional alchemist. So I hope that you enjoyed this talk, this mother's story. And I hope to see you next week. God bless you all. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Good night.